This is Story Recapped. Today, I'm going to explain a horror film called Cat People. The story follows a young woman who struggles to keep herself chaste because she's afraid of unleashing her animalistic nature once she gives in to temptation. Spoilers ahead. Watch out and take care.
Most people suppress their desires to follow cultural norms and values. The act of repression makes us suffer, but sometimes we suffer even more when we get what we're craving. Our desires take control and turn us into something else. For most people, the transformation is symbolic, but for Irina, it is quite literal. She has managed to avoid giving in to her desires for years, but how much longer can she hold on when she meets a man who captures her heart? In a barren desert long ago, a group of men captures a woman from a village and ties her up to a tree nearby. As the darkness envelops the sky, the men leave, but one of the men stays behind and waits for someone to claim their sacrifice. Soon, a black panther arrives and approaches the woman. The sacrificial maiden is startled by the panther's growls, but she doesn't scream as the wild animal lunges at her and licks her neck. One day, a man leads another woman to a cave where the panther awaits, but the animal doesn't attack the girl when she walks inside. The woman bravely faces her fate, staring back at the panther with its eyes fixed on her. Our protagonist appears nowhere in the opening scene, but it gives us a glimpse of her true nature. The first woman was unwilling when she was abducted, but seemed to have surrendered herself to the panther when it arrived. The second woman wasn't bound at all, which indicates that she was prepared to face the panther. The fate of the woman is left to the viewer's imagination, but the beast's actions suggest that it mated with the girls instead of devouring them. It follows that the resulting offspring from the licentious sacrifice would become the cat people. Ages later, in New Orleans, Irina Gallier arrives at the airport from Canada to meet her estranged brother Paul. On her way to a payphone, Paul follows Irina and introduces himself before she can make a call. Paul welcomes Irina to New Orleans with a warm hug and takes her to his house, where his Creole housekeeper, Family, enthusiastically greets them. Paul notes that apart from keeping the house clean, Family keeps him out of trouble. During dinner, Irina tells Paul about how nice her adoptive family was to her. Her adoptive parents didn't tell her much about Paul, but she recounts that she used to fantasize about Paul coming to rescue her from the orphanage. Paul notes that he used to have the same daydreams about her. Later, Paul takes her to a hallway upstairs and shows her the circus accessories and pictures he kept from the time that they were still at the circus with their parents. Paul suddenly starts his juggling act and passes the balls to Irina, who surprisingly still remembers how to juggle. After Irina falls asleep, Paul visits her in her room and sits on the foot of the bed, grunting softly as he observes her. The fantasies and daydreams between Paul and Irina indicate that there is a strong connection between them. Paul was a bit puzzled by Irina's use of the word fantasize because of its sensual connotations, but she clarifies that they were just childhood fantasies and there was nothing sensual about them. Paul's collection shows that he held on to his family roots after he was adopted. Irina couldn't do the same, but she still remembers the things that she learned. Paul likely showed Irina the circus accessories not only to reminisce about the past, but also to help her reconnect with their roots. We get a brief look at their hidden nature when Paul visits Irina in her room while she is sleeping. He watches her as a predator would watch its prey, but for him, Irina is a different kind of prey, as we shall soon see. Somewhere in the city, a working lady named Ruthie enters a motel to meet her client who has been waiting for over half an hour. When she enters the room, she starts laying down the rules and rates of their appointment, but the client wouldn't respond. As she waits for the client, she notices a slimy substance on the bed and a tail of a wild animal on the floor. She gently nudges the tail away when it starts moving, but the animal soon grabs her foot and tries to pull her under the bed. The woman quickly crawls down the stairs calling for help. Upon seeing her mangled foot, Ruthie starts screaming in pain and dread. In the morning, Dr. Oliver Yates, the curator of the New Orleans Zoo, arrives with his assistants Alice and Joe to capture the loose leopard in the motel. Detective Bill Searle and the motel clerk have no clue how the animal got inside, but they tell Oliver that it is trapped in a room upstairs. Oliver and his assistants are surprised by the leopard's large size when they see it on the video feed. After estimating the leopard's weight, Oliver instructs Joe to prepare 2,000 milligrams of ketamine to knock the animal out and put him in a squeeze cage. The scene hints that the animal is not a normal leopard. Although we never get to see its transformation, the clerk didn't know how the animal got inside, which suggests that in a different form, possibly human, when it entered the building. It looks like the leopard is not only trapped inside the room, it is now trapped in its current form. It implies that the leopard cannot easily transform back into a human. It could also be maintaining its current form on purpose because it's already being observed. A few moments later, Oliver climbs up the ladder to the window to shoot the animal with the tranquilizer. As he climbs up the window, he hears the animal growling ferociously. Oliver nearly falls down from the ladder when the agitated leopard pounces on the window. After managing to get back into position on the ladder, Oliver takes out his tranquilizer gun and shoots the animal on its hind legs, causing it to run around wildly in the room. Irina suddenly wakes up, sensing that something must have happened to Paul. She knocks on his room, but no one answers. As the leopard starts to fall asleep, Oliver and Joe enter the room and cast a net over the animal. Soon, Irina goes downstairs to look for Paul, but Family tells her that he got up early in the morning to go to church. Irina is disappointed because Paul was supposed to take her on a trip around the city, so Family tells her to get a guidebook and see the sights for herself. After wandering around the French Quarter on her own, she decides to stop by the church to look for Paul. However, a woman working there tells her that Paul never came in that day. Irina's strong connection to Paul has caused her to wake up the moment the leopard was hit with the tranquilizer. This strongly implies that the leopard is Paul. His absence from the church further affirms this. The zookeepers were quite surprised by the sight of the leopard, so it must be the first time they've encountered such an animal. It's unlikely that this was Paul's first time to transform, so he must have gotten careless that night. The next day, Irina takes another trip around the city and decides to stop by the zoo. Once inside, she goes straight to the cages where the felines are being kept and sees the black leopard that Oliver captured. She takes out her sketch pad from her bag and starts drawing the animal. At the zoo's office, Oliver tells city officials that the leopard is safe in his cage, but an official suggests euthanizing the animal because they don't have the funds to keep it there. Oliver strongly objects to the idea, arguing that it's not an acceptable solution despite the lack of funds at the zoo. Hours later, the zoo is shut down, but Irina is still sketching the leopard. When Oliver approaches her, she drops her belongings and instinctively runs toward a tree. She ends up climbing on top of the tree as Oliver continues to pursue her. However, Irina eventually goes down after Oliver assures her that he's not going to hurt her. Oliver is perplexed that Irina is scared of him, but she's not frightened by the leopard. Irina explains that she can sense how animals feel sometimes. As they walk back to the leopard's cage, Irina suddenly feels dizzy, so Oliver checks her temperature and finds out that she's feverish. Oliver takes her inside his office to give her an aspirin, but she refuses, saying she's just exhausted and hungry because she forgot to eat. Due to the hints that we've seen in the previous scene, it's no longer surprising that Irina is drawn to the leopard. She may have forgotten about her wild side, but she is getting closer and closer to rediscovering it. Irina shows the first sign of wild nature when she instinctively gets on top of a tree. As an animal lover, it's unlikely that Oliver wouldn't notice Irina's animalistic character. In just a short while, it looks like he is already intrigued by her unusual personality. Irina asks Oliver to have dinner with her, so he takes her to a seafood restaurant. During their meal, Oliver learns that Irina is looking for work, so he offers her a job at the zoo's gift shop. The following day, Oliver visits Irina at the gift shop to see how she's doing. Despite the low wages, Irina tells Oliver that she's enjoying the job because she likes to be around the animals. Later that day, Alice visits the gift shop and introduces herself to Irina. When she learns that Irina hasn't seen all the sights in New Orleans, she invites her for a drink and offers to help her out with an itinerary. At the bar, Alice thwarts a man's attempt to flirt with Irina and tells her that she could do better. Alice assures her that she'll eventually find someone compatible with her, but Irina says she wouldn't know because she's inexperienced. Alice is a bit shocked by her revelation, so she asks Irina to recount her closest encounters. As Irina relates her experience with a boy she liked, a woman interrupts her, calling her mi hermana. Alice tells her that she referred to Irina as her sister, but since Irina doesn't know the woman, Alice deduces that she must have been drunk. Oliver's fascination with Irina becomes more apparent when he offers her a job at the zoo. They could have simply kept dating, but this way, he could visit her during the day instead of waiting for the zoo to close before they could meet. At the bar, we hear for the first time that Irina is still inexperienced in bed. This particular detail is worth remembering as we learn more about Irina's secrets. The woman who interrupts their conversation plants a question in Irina's mind about her identity, although she brushes it aside quickly. When Irina goes to work the next day, she hears the leopard growling, so she decides to visit the animal as Joe prepares to clean up his cage. Joe prompts the leopard to move, but Irina tells him that the animal is afraid. The leopard gets more agitated and snarls at Joe, so he decides to use the electric prod against the feral beast. However, the leopard snags the prod when Joe starts shoving it inside the cage. Oliver tries to drag Joe away from the cage, but the ravenous cat keeps pulling with its claws and teeth until it rips off Joe's arm. Oliver tells the zoo personnel to call the paramedics, but Joe is already dying from blood loss. Oliver then takes a rifle from his house to shoot the leopard, but the untamed cat is already gone when they go back to its cage. When Irina gets back home, Paul stops by her room and discloses that he went to the penitentiary, but clarifies that he was there to pray for the prisoners. Paul tells Irina that she must be ready to mate since he saw her with Oliver. Irina is distressed by his suggestion, but Paul continues to insinuate that Irina's desire to copulate with Oliver is growing intensely. However, Paul points out that the emotion that she feels is not love, but a craving for blood. Paul hints that he's in the same predicament, and they can only escape if they help each other. Paul finally escapes from the cage after killing Joe. This suggests that Paul was only able to turn into a human again after killing someone. He finally tells Irina something about their family's secret, but he does it in a very ambiguous way. He only hints that she couldn't be with Oliver because it would put him in danger. Paul doesn't tell her about the transformation she'll go through, but he implies that something bad will happen when she has carnal relations with someone other than him. Irina insists that she's not like Paul, so he reminds Irina of her childhood when she used to hear the animals call her name. He also points out that she couldn't sleep soundly at the time because she knew when the others were dreaming. When Paul starts forcing himself upon Irina, she leaps from the balcony and runs out onto the streets. Paul tries to follow her, but he disappears when Irina asks the police for help. The cops try to investigate the situation, but Irina feels that the threat is gone, so she tells the police that she made a mistake thinking someone was after her. Before the cops can leave, they notice that the police dog is barking incessantly, so they decide to call for backup. Later on, detectives arrive at the house and start questioning Femily about the odd things in the basement. As they wait to hear from the laboratory, Detective Brandt takes Alice to the basement to show her the animal cage, hinting that the leopard used to be confined there. He notes that they have found around 3 or 4 bodies inside, and they believe that there's more buried around the premises. Brandt suspects that Paul killed the humans before feeding them to the animal. Alice is perplexed about Paul's motives, so Brandt explains that Paul had been going in and out of psych wards since he was a child, and has become a religious fanatic. Brandt further points out that Paul was able to raise the leopard on his own because he grew up with them, noting that his parents were lion tamers. The discovery of the corpses has forced Paul to put his plans for Irina on hold because he now has to go into hiding. Although Irina resisted Paul's advances, she didn't intend to expose him. As her brother hides, Irina now has to make sense of the secret she learned by herself. She still refuses to believe, but Paul had reminded her of things that strongly point to her feral side. Irina must now be careful about pursuing a relationship with Oliver because it could end badly if Paul is right. When Alice asks if Irina is involved, Brandt discloses that the police have no reason to suspect her. He further notes that there's an indication that Paul wanted to kill Irina. Since Paul is still at large, Oliver offers to let Irina stay at his house. Suspecting that Femily is involved in Paul's crimes, the police decide to arrest her. Oliver takes Irina home and gets her situated in the makeshift darkroom. Before Oliver leaves the room, Irina expresses her disbelief over Paul's horrible acts. In the morning, Oliver takes her to his cabin in the countryside to help take her mind off the recent tragedies. Upon their arrival, they're greeted by Yeet Man. who helped Oliver build the cabin. Back in the city, Paul shows up at the cemetery and flirts with a woman by taking her picture. That night, Oliver starts seducing Irina, making no effort to hide that he wants to make love with her. Although Irina wants to be with him, she tells Oliver that she can't be physically intimate. At that exact moment, Paul tries to make love to the woman he met at the cemetery, but he can't seem to take his mind off Irina. Thinking that Paul is just nervous, the woman makes another attempt to turn him on. Later on, Irina wakes up in the middle of the night and starts feeling the urge to copulate with Oliver. However, Irina decides to go outside instead after hearing the animal noises. As she walks toward the woods, she starts removing her clothing. When she comes across a rabbit, she chases after it and snags the helpless animal with her teeth. Irina manages to resist her urges to get intimate with Oliver. However, she couldn't resist her feral nature. She seems to be getting deeper into her roots as time goes on, so it could possibly be a matter of time when she turns into a large cat. Paul had obviously gotten used to the deaths that resulted from his carnal encounters, but something still nags at him. He may be able to brush aside his guilt over the murders, but he can't ignore his desire for Irina. Moments later, Oliver wakes up from the noise of the door as Irina arrives. When he turns on the light, Irina knocks the lamp to the floor, telling Oliver not to look at her. In the morning, Paul wakes up in his bathroom covered in slime. After cleaning himself up, he looks around the room and finds the woman's mangled body on the floor. Soon, Brandt discovers the body and figures out that she was attacked by the leopard, so he invites Oliver and Alice to take a look. Later on, Irina decides to pack her bags and leave Oliver's house, but Oliver arrives just in time to stop her. Irina points out that she's going crazy like her brother, but Oliver insists that she has nothing to do with him. Oliver confesses his love for Irina, but she tells him that they can't ever be intimate. Despite Irina's refusal to sleep with him, Oliver tells her that he still wants to take care of her. Unbeknownst to them, Paul is on top of a tree nearby, observing them. Irina is now starting to accept that she's just like her brother, so she has to stay away from Oliver. She tries to dissuade Oliver from falling for her by telling him that they can't ever be intimate, but he is persistent. Irina is the first woman Oliver fell in love with, and he senses that she's also in love with him, so he can't just let her go. Oliver has already seen traces of Irina's wild side, so he is not totally oblivious to what's happening with her. Irina will have to reveal the truth to him to help him understand what she's afraid of. Oliver and the police continue to look for the feral leopard, but Searle tells Oliver that the police will call off the search soon because they can no longer afford the manpower. Oliver expresses his disapproval and punches Searle for pointing out that he refused to kill the leopard when it was still in the cage. On their way home, Alice warns Oliver that he's becoming obsessed with Irina, but he contends that he knows what he's doing. That night, Paul breaks into Oliver's house through the window in Irina's room while she's reading a magazine in bed. Irina immediately goes into a defensive position upon hearing the noise, but she loosens up when she determines that Paul doesn't mean her any harm. Paul approaches her and begs her to save him, saying she's the only one capable of stopping him from killing. He tells her that they can be together as mates, just as their parents did, noting that they were also brother and sister. When Irina insists that she's not like Paul, he points out that she could end up killing Oliver by her refusal to acknowledge the truth. Paul stresses that Oliver only likes Irina because he fears her feral nature. Despite everything she's heard, Irina still refuses to be with Paul, so he takes a shard of glass from the floor, suggesting that he'll take his own life. To keep him from doing anything foolish, Irina embraces Paul and takes the shard from his hand, promising to be his mate. However, Irina uses the shard to stab Paul's hand and runs away. As his hand bleeds, Paul starts transforming into a leopard. Paul shows that he's not totally remorseless when he kills people when he begs Irina to become his mate. At the very least, he no longer wants to continue killing. Becoming mates appears natural for people like them, but since Irina hadn't lived among her kind, she's repulsed by the idea. Paul's desperate acts couldn't even change her mind. All he could do was find another way to convince Irina, but he had already waited a long time to be with her, so his patience had run out. When Oliver and Alice arrive at the house, Oliver immediately heads to Irina's room to ask her to come down for coffee. He doesn't hear Irina respond, but he hears a noise, so he decides to go inside to investigate. Oliver immediately takes notice of a strange presence in the room. As lightning strikes, he sees a monstrous man approaching him and yelling his name, but as it walks towards him, it turns into a leopard. Before the ferocious cat could reach him, Oliver covers it with a curtain and tells Alice to get the shotgun. Alice hurriedly takes a firearm from the shelf and runs to the dark room, but she can't open the door because the knob is broken. Alice manages to open the door and shoots the leopard before it can attack Oliver. With the leopard dead on the ground, Irina approaches the body and cries in the anguish of losing her brother. When Oliver conducts a necropsy on the leopard in the morning, he is horrified to discover a human hand inside its body. Not long, toxic smoke starts coming out of the carcass, causing Oliver to cough erratically as it rapidly disintegrates. When Irina visits Family in prison, she immediately deduces that Paul has died. Irina tries asking her about her true nature, but Family stresses that she shouldn't ask what she already knows. Family advises Irina to be like Paul, hidden in jails and never loved. Soon after leaving the prison, Irina decides to go as far from New Orleans as possible, so she takes a train to Richmond. With Paul gone, there's no one to help Irina to take control of her feral instincts. Family couldn't help because she's not one of them, and she's in prison. Family's advice sounds extreme, but this might be Irina's only choice to avoid hurting anyone. Her situation has left her confused and directionless, so she just runs away without even saying goodbye to Oliver. Irina can start over, and live as she did before meeting Paul, but she could never quench her desires. Upon her arrival, she experiences a hallucination and meets Paul in the desert. He reveals that their ancestors once sacrificed children to leopards, causing the children's souls to grow inside the ravenous beasts until they turn into humans. He reiterates that they can only make love with their own, because they will transform into leopards if they do it with others. The only way for them to transform into humans again is to kill. Paul welcomes Irina for accepting her true nature, but he urges her to return to New Orleans. When Alice goes jogging one day, she decides to go to the gym for a quick dip in the pool. As she is changing her clothes, she hears a large growl outside the locker room, so she quickly jumps into the water. Alice starts to whimper and panic after the lights suddenly go off, with the growls getting louder. She screams at the top of her lungs when she sees a shadow moving in the showers, but Irina soon emerges and turns the light on. Alice accuses Irina of attempting to kill her, but Irina claims that she's only looking for Oliver. Irina smirks as she apologizes for frightening Alice. After Irina leaves the gym, Alice checks her clothes and finds that her sweater has been inexplicably torn. Irina finally learns everything about her roots due to her hallucination. She seemed to have embraced her wild side and has chosen to become predatory like Paul upon her return to New Orleans. She must have seen Alice as a rival to Oliver's affections, so she stalks her. Alice must have known that Irina could turn into a cat even before she encountered her at the pool, because she accused her of attempting to kill her even though she only heard the growls of a leopard. It is likely that Oliver knows about it too, because he was the one who saw the bizarre disintegration of the leopard's carcass during the necropsy. While Oliver is developing photos of Irina in his dark room, he hears the phone ringing, but it is off the hook when he goes down to answer it. Soon, the phone rings again, and he is greeted by Alice's voice when he answers. Alice tells him that Irina followed her, and discloses her suspicion that Irina wanted to hurt her. When Oliver sees Irina's reflection on a framed poster in front of him, he hangs up and follows Irina as she leads him to his room. On the way, Irina confidently takes off her clothes and looks back at Oliver suggestively, prompting him to keep following her. When she finally reaches the bed, Oliver removes his clothing and starts making love to Irina. After their lovemaking, Irina goes to the bathroom and finds blood on her private part. Upon her returning to bed, Irina starts to transform into a feral cat while Oliver sleeps soundly beside her. Oliver is soon jolted awake from her loud growl, but she manages to restrain herself when she hears him beg for his life. When Irina runs out of the house, she is immediately spotted by the police. Soon, Alice stops by Oliver's house to tell him that the leopard was found at the bridge. Irina finally decides to give in to her desires, despite knowing that she'll turn into a ferocious cat. Although Oliver is afraid, he doesn't seem too surprised by the sight of the cat. He calls her Irina when he begs for his life, which means he knows it could happen. Oliver's lust and curiosity have led him to take the risk and find out what's really drawing him to Irina. Fortunately, Irina still recognizes him in her feral form, and she is still able to control her instinct to kill. When Oliver arrives, the confused leopard is already surrounded by the cops. The leopard jumps into the river when she sees Oliver in the crowd, prompting the police to shoot at her several times. With no sign of the animal in the water, Oliver gets back in his car and drives to the cabin, thinking the leopard might be headed there. When he arrives, he comes across Yeet Man's corpse hanging on a tree. Inside the cabin, he finds Irina, who immediately confesses that she killed Yeet Man. Oliver asserts that Irina could have killed him instead, but she confesses that she's in love with him. She urges Oliver to kill her, but he refuses, so she asks him to make love to her again to set her free and be with her own kind. Oliver accedes to Irina's request, but he ties up her hands and feet to the bed before copulating with her. Irina grabs the rope tight when Oliver begins to make love to her. A few days pass, and Oliver continues his work as a curator of the zoo. After checking on the condition of a large snake, Alice invites Oliver to lunch, but he declines and decides to check on the cats in the zoo instead. When he reaches the leopard cage, he feeds it with a small piece of meat and gently strokes its neck. Irina has forgotten her true nature after being estranged from her family for a long time. When she reunites with Paul, he does his best to remind Irina of her wild side. Paul wanted her to be his mate because it's the only way for them to copulate without transforming into a ferocious animal. Irina finds his proposal distasteful because she grew up never learning the ways of their kind. By the time she embraces her true nature, it's already too late because Paul is gone. She faces it by getting intimate with Oliver despite the huge risk. After her transformation, she accepts her fate to remain caged for the rest of her life, so she would no longer pose a threat to humans.
Subscribe to watch more videos like this. Turn on notifications. And leave a like, it really helps the channel out. Thank you for watching.